My boyfriend looked up from his dinner plate and said, in the calmest voice imaginable, "I don't love you anymore. I haven't for months." For a moment, I genuinely thought I'd heard him wrong. 10 seconds earlier, we were discussing a television show and deciding what to watch later that week. Nothing about the evening suggested my relationship was about to end. Then he put his fork down, looked directly at me, and delivered a speech that sounded rehearsed enough to have been practiced beforehand. The speech sounded rehearsed, almost as if he'd been carrying it around for days, waiting for the right moment. "My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 31 years old, and that conversation happened 5 weeks ago. At the time, Ryan Carter and I had been together for 18 months. For the previous 7 months, he had practically been living in my townhouse. Officially, Ryan didn't live with me. In reality, half my closet was his. His coffee mug sat beside mine every morning, and most nights he slept in my bed. Packages arrived under his name almost weekly. The apartment he rented across town had gradually become a place where he stored furniture and paid bills. We had discussed making things official more than once. Every time the subject came up, Ryan would smile and tell me he just needed a little more time. He always seemed to need a little more time before taking the next step. I never pushed the issue because I assumed healthy relationships moved at their own pace. Looking back, I think Ryan spent so much time searching for certainty that he stopped appreciating what he already had. At the dinner table that night, however, I knew none of that. All I knew was that the man I loved was sitting across from me saying he hadn't loved me for months. I set my fork down and listened. Ryan explained that he'd been feeling disconnected for a long time. He said he thought we should end things, and that it would be better for both of us if we moved on. Then he stopped talking. What struck me wasn't what he said. It was the way he looked at me afterward. He wasn't relieved or devastated. If anything, he seemed focused on me, watching carefully as though my reaction mattered more than the breakup itself. What caught my attention wasn't the breakup itself. It was the brief look of disappointment that crossed his face when I didn't react the way he expected. "Thank you for being honest." His expression changed immediately. "That's it?" I looked at him. What else would I say? Ryan blinked. "You're not going to ask why? You've clearly thought about this for a long time." "That's not an answer." "It kind of is." The confusion on his face grew. I continued calmly. "You just told me you haven't loved me for months. If you've been unhappy that long, there isn't a conversation over dinner that's suddenly going to fix it." For the first time that evening, Ryan looked unsettled. The conversation wasn't unfolding the way he expected. I could feel it. Every answer I gave seemed to push him further off balance. When I stood up and held out my hand, he looked even more confused. "What are you doing?" "I need my key back." His mouth actually opened. "Right now?" "Yes." "Seriously?" "We're not together anymore." For several seconds, he just stared at me. Then he laughed nervously. "Claire, come on." "I'm serious." His eyes narrowed. "You want my key tonight?" "Of course." The discussion that followed felt stranger than the breakup itself. Ryan kept asking questions as if he expected me to change my mind. I kept giving the same answer. Eventually, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the key, and dropped it onto the table hard enough for it to rattle against the wood. "There." I picked it up. "Thank you." His frustration became obvious. "This is really how you're handling this?" The question genuinely surprised me. "You're the one ending the relationship." "Yeah, but—" He stopped himself midway through the sentence, but the look on his face said the rest. Somehow he expected resistance, maybe an argument, maybe tears, maybe a reason to stay. "Yeah, but you were supposed to convince me to stay?" At the time, I couldn't put my finger on it. I just knew something about the situation felt off. Ryan grabbed his jacket and headed toward the door. I followed behind him. When he reached the entryway, he turned around one last time. For a brief moment, I thought he might take everything back. Instead, he asked, "You're really not going to stop me?" That was the first moment I felt a flicker of understanding. Not a full realization, just a feeling. A feeling that this conversation wasn't actually about ending a relationship. It was about something else. Something Ryan expected from me. Something he wasn't getting. "If leaving is what you want," I said, "then leave." His jaw tightened. A second later, he walked out and slammed the door behind him. The sound echoed through the house. Then everything became quiet. I stood there for a while expecting some overwhelming emotional collapse. It never came. I was hurt. There was no denying that. 18 months mattered. Ryan mattered. But his words had removed every ounce of uncertainty from the situation. He said he didn't love me. I chose to believe him. After cleaning the kitchen, I sat on the couch and updated my social media accounts. I removed relationship photos, changed my status, updated my profile picture. Then I blocked his access to my posts. It wasn't dramatic. It was practical. As far as I was concerned, the relationship had ended the moment he said it was over. Around 10 that night, my phone started vibrating. At first, I ignored it. Then it vibrated again and again. By 11 o'clock, the screen looked ridiculous. Missed calls, texts, voicemails, more notifications arriving every few seconds. Every single one came from Ryan. I stared at the screen in disbelief. Just hours earlier, he had calmly explained why we needed to break up. Now he suddenly seemed desperate to talk. The calls continued past midnight. By midnight, my phone showed more than 50 missed calls. What confused me wasn't the number. It was the fact that the man who had calmly ended our relationship a few hours earlier suddenly sounded terrified that I might actually let him go. The next morning brought even more. I sat in bed scrolling through them, trying to understand what was happening. The messages weren't apologetic. They weren't explanations either. Most of them revolved around the same complaint. Why wasn't I responding? Why wasn't I trying? Why wasn't I fighting for us? The more I read, the stranger it became. Ryan sounded less like someone who regretted ending a relationship and more like someone shocked that his plan hadn't worked. That thought stayed with me throughout the morning. Then, just before 7 o'clock, my doorbell camera sent a notification to my phone. I opened the app. Ryan was standing on my front porch. And judging by the expression on his face, the real drama was only beginning. Ryan started pounding on my front door at 7 o'clock on a Wednesday morning. Not hard enough to damage anything, but hard enough to make it clear he wasn't there for a casual conversation. I was standing in my kitchen making coffee when the notification appeared on my phone. Through the camera, I watched him pace across the porch, run a hand through his hair, then come back and ring the bell again. The man looked exhausted. His eyes were red. His clothes were wrinkled. He looked nothing like the calm, confident person who had ended our relationship less than 12 hours earlier. When he noticed the camera light activate, he stepped closer. "Claire, I know you're in there." I pressed the microphone button. "Ryan, go home." His shoulders immediately tensed. "We need to talk." "We already did." "No, we didn't." I took a sip of coffee and leaned against the counter. The strange thing was that I wasn't angry anymore. Confused, yes. Curious, definitely. But mostly, I was trying to understand why someone who supposedly wanted to leave was now acting like I had abandoned him. "Ryan, you broke up with me." "That's not what happened." That answer made me stop, because it was the first clue that something much stranger was going on. I frowned. "You literally told me you didn't love me anymore." "I said some things. You said you hadn't loved me for months." His jaw tightened. "Can you just open the door?" "No." For several seconds, he stared directly into the camera. Then he laughed once, though there wasn't anything funny about the situation. "I can't believe you're doing this." That sentence bothered me more than I expected. Not because it hurt, because it implied I was the one who had changed the rules. I wasn't. I was operating entirely on the information he had given me. Eventually, Ryan shook his head and walked away. Before leaving, he kicked my doormat halfway across the porch. A childish ending to a ridiculous visit. I went to work expecting the drama to settle down. Instead, it got worse. Around lunchtime, messages started arriving from mutual friends. At first, they were harmless. People asking if I was okay. People wondering what had happened. Then the stories became more specific. One friend asked why I had thrown Ryan out. Another asked why I had refused to listen to him. A third asked if the breakup had really happened because of an argument. By the end of the afternoon, it became obvious Ryan had been talking. A lot. And somehow his version of events barely resembled reality. That evening, I received a text from someone saved in my phone as Emily, Ryan's sister. At least the woman I believed was his sister. The message was simple. "What happened? Ryan hasn't stopped crying since yesterday." I stared at it. Then I looked at the timestamp. Yesterday. Not last week. Not last month. Yesterday. We hadn't even been broken up for a full day. I replied honestly. Ryan told me he didn't love me anymore and wanted to end the relationship. I accepted it. A few minutes later, another message arrived. He said you basically kicked him out. I laughed under my breath. Not because it was funny. Because the speed at which reality was being rewritten was honestly impressive. He ended the relationship. I asked for my key back. Those aren't the same thing. No response came after that, which told me everything I needed to know. Even the people closest to Ryan were struggling to defend what had happened once they heard the full story. The next evening brought another surprise. My phone rang just after 6. The caller ID showed Megan, Ryan's best friend. I considered ignoring it. Then curiosity won. "Hello?" "Claire, thank God." I immediately regretted answering. "Megan, what do you want?" "We need to talk about Ryan." "No, we don't. Please just hear me out." I sat down at my kitchen table. Something told me this conversation was about to explain a lot. Megan took a deep breath. "He's not doing well." "I'm sorry to hear that." "That's all you're going to say?" "What exactly are you expecting me to say?" She hesitated. Then she asked the question that changed everything. "Why didn't you fight for him?" For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. "What?" "Ryan needed to know how much you cared." I stared at the wall. Slowly. Very slowly. The pieces started falling into place. Suddenly, everything from the previous 2 days made sense. The nonstop calls, the panic, the pressure coming from his friends, even the anger whenever I refused to play along. This was a test? Megan didn't answer immediately. That told me more than words could. Finally, she said, "He was scared." Scared of what? That you weren't as committed as he was. I laughed. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just the kind of laugh people make when they've finally discovered the answer to a mystery and wish they hadn't. So his solution was to tell me he didn't love me anymore? You're making it sound worse than it was. I almost dropped the phone. Worse than it was? Claire, you're focusing on the words. The words are literally the problem. Megan groaned. You're missing the point. No, Ryan missed the point. The conversation went downhill after that. Megan insisted Ryan only wanted reassurance. I pointed out that emotionally healthy adults usually ask for reassurance instead of staging a breakup. She said people make mistakes. I agreed. But mistakes and manipulation weren't always the same thing. Eventually, she got frustrated. Then I got frustrated. Then the entire conversation became pointless. Before hanging up, she delivered one final message. Ryan wants another chance. I looked out the window. The sun was setting behind the neighboring houses. 2 days earlier, I would have done almost anything to protect that relationship. Now I wasn't even sure I recognized the person I had been dating. He had his chance. You don't mean that. I do. You're being stubborn. No, Megan. I stood up from the table. I'm finally listening. The call ended shortly afterward. I blocked her number, not out of anger, out of exhaustion. Because the more people talked, the clearer the situation became. Ryan wasn't upset because he lost me. At least not entirely. Ryan was upset because I hadn't reacted the way he expected. That realization sat heavily in my mind for the rest of the evening. Then, just before midnight, an email arrived. The sender was Ryan. The subject line read, "Please read this." I opened it. By the time I reached the end, I understood exactly how deep the problem really went. And I realized Saturday, the day Ryan came to collect his things, wasn't going to be a simple exchange of boxes. It was going to be the moment reality finally caught up with him. Ryan's email was long enough that I had to read it twice. By the time I finished reading, I found myself scrolling back to the beginning. That's when I started noticing what wasn't there. There was no apology for telling me he didn't love me. No apology for claiming he'd felt that way for months. No acknowledgement that he had ended the relationship. Instead, the entire email revolved around one idea: I had failed him. Ryan wrote that he'd been struggling with doubts, that he needed reassurance, that he wanted to know whether I would stay when things got difficult. He described feeling insecure, uncertain, afraid of getting hurt. Parts of the email felt honest, which somehow made it even more frustrating because none of it changed what he'd actually done. By the time I reached the end, I understood something important. Ryan wasn't trying to repair the relationship. He was trying to justify what he'd done. I closed the email and sat quietly for a while. Then I typed a single response. You told me you didn't love me anymore. I believed you. That was it. No argument, no lecture, no emotional speech. Just the truth. His reply arrived less than 5 minutes later. Can I at least get my things? I stared at the screen. Finally, a reasonable question. Saturday, 2 o'clock. A moment later, another message appeared. Can we talk then? Number. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, please. I didn't answer, because there wasn't anything left to discuss. The next 2 days were strangely productive. I packed everything Ryan had left at my house. Clothes, books, toiletries, shoes, phone chargers, gym equipment, random kitchen items he'd slowly claimed as his own. The more I packed, the more I noticed how much space he'd occupied. Not just physically, financially too, emotionally, practically. By Friday night, curiosity got the better of me. I sat down with my banking app and started doing rough calculations. The numbers surprised me. Once I added together groceries, utilities, subscriptions, restaurant bills, gas, and weekend expenses, the number was much higher than I expected. Small expenses that had never seemed significant on their own. Together, they added up to several $100s every month. I wasn't angry about it. Relationships involve sharing. That's normal. What bothered me was realizing how much effort I'd invested, while Ryan apparently spent the same period wondering whether my feelings were real. That imbalance hit harder than the breakup itself. Saturday arrived. At exactly 2 o'clock, my doorbell rang. I checked the camera. Ryan wasn't alone. Standing beside him was his mother. I closed my eyes for a second. Of course he brought his mother. I opened the door anyway. The boxes were already stacked neatly near the entrance. Everything was organized. Everything was labeled. Everything was ready to leave. Ryan looked terrible. Dark circles under his eyes. Shoulders slumped. The confidence he'd shown at the dinner table was completely gone. His mother stepped forward immediately. Claire, sweetheart, can we talk? No. The answer came out calmly. Her smile faltered. Claire, you're throwing away a good man over one mistake. No, I'm dealing with the consequences of a decision he made. Ryan looked down at the floor. His mother tried again. Relationships are complicated. Not this one. That surprised her. I continued. Ryan told me he didn't love me. Then he broke up with me. That's not exactly. It is exactly what happened. Ryan finally spoke. Claire, please. I looked at him. For the first time since all this started, he didn't seem angry. He looked scared. I made a mistake. The words hung between us. A week earlier, hearing that might have changed everything. Now it didn't change anything at all. Because mistakes happen in moments. This had taken planning, thought, intention. You didn't make a mistake, Ryan. His face fell. You made a decision. His mother immediately jumped in. He loves you. I looked at her. Then he should have said that. Nobody had an answer. Ryan swallowed hard. I was scared. I know. His head lifted. For a second, hope flashed across his face. Then I continued. But being scared doesn't excuse what you did. The hope disappeared. I didn't know how to ask for reassurance. Then you should have asked badly. Ryan frowned. What? You could have asked awkwardly. I shrugged. You could have said the wrong thing. You could have stumbled through the conversation. You could have admitted you were insecure. His eyes stayed locked on mine. I continued quietly. Instead, you told me you didn't love me. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Because there wasn't a defense for that. There never had been. Eventually, his mother picked up one of the boxes. Ryan grabbed another. The conversation was over. Before leaving, he stopped beside the car and looked back. You really don't think we can fix this? The question sounded genuine. Painfully genuine. Which somehow made it worse. Because now he finally understood what he'd done. And understanding it now didn't undo it. No. His eyes closed briefly. Then he nodded. Not because he agreed. Because he finally accepted it. They drove away a few minutes later. I honestly thought that would be the end. It wasn't. During the following week, mutual friends started reaching out. Apparently, Ryan was telling people he regretted everything. Some thought I should give him another chance. Others thought I was doing the right thing. Most stayed out of it. Then something unexpected happened. I received an email from a woman named Vanessa Moore, Ryan's ex-girlfriend. I almost deleted it. Curiosity stopped me. The email wasn't dramatic. It wasn't vindictive. It was surprisingly calm. Vanessa explained in that she and Ryan had dated for nearly 2 years before they broke up. As I read, my stomach slowly tightened. Because the story sounded familiar. Too familiar. Ryan had constantly needed reassurance. He pulled away emotionally whenever he felt insecure. He created situations designed to measure how much she cared. He interpreted ordinary disagreements as evidence that she might leave. Eventually, she became exhausted. One sentence stood out more than anything else. You're not the first woman he's done this to. I wasn't the first either. Ryan didn't lose our relationship because he wasn't loved. He lost it because he couldn't believe he was loved. I stared at that sentence for a long time. Because it explained almost everything. A few days later, another mutual friend confirmed something similar. Daniel told me something Ryan never had. Months before the breakup, Ryan had already been talking about moving in permanently and possibly proposing within the next year. He wanted certainty about our future and the security that came with knowing where the relationship was headed. But instead of asking for those things directly, he'd convinced himself he needed some kind of proof first. And that proof had become the breakup itself. What started as his attempt to gain certainty ultimately became the thing that destroyed the relationship he was trying to protect. A few days after that, Ryan sent one final email. This one felt different. There was no blame, no excuses, no attempts to twist reality. For the first time, he sounded honest. He admitted he'd been afraid. Admitted he'd spent too much time looking for reassurance. Admitted he'd treated trust like something that needed constant verification. Then he wrote something I still remember. I spent so much time trying to measure your feelings that I never realized you were trusting mine. That line stayed with me. Because it was true. Trust had never been the problem. The lack of trust was. I never replied. Not because I hated him. Not because I wanted revenge. Because there was nothing left to say. The relationship was over. Dragging it out wouldn't change that. 5 weeks later, life looked very different. The house felt peaceful again. The constant tension was gone. I slept better. Spent less money. Stopped second-guessing myself. And somewhere along the way, I met someone new. His name was Ethan Brooks. We met at a friend's birthday party. For several weeks, he was simply someone I enjoyed talking to. Neither of us was rushing anything. Nothing dramatic happened. There wasn't some dramatic spark or movie-style moment. We simply started talking, and neither of us noticed how much time had passed. What stood out about Ethan was how straightforward he was. Ethan wasn't perfect, but talking to him felt easy. If something was on his mind, he usually said it instead of turning it into a guessing game. After everything with Ryan, the simplicity of that felt refreshing. A few weeks later, we were having coffee when he said something that stuck with me. Life is complicated enough already. Relationships shouldn't be. I smiled because I finally understood what he meant. For a long time, I'd mistaken emotional chaos for depth. I'd mistaken insecurity for passion. I'd mistaken constant reassurance for intimacy. Now I knew better. A few days later, Ryan texted me from a new number. "I heard you're seeing someone. That was fast." I looked at the message. Then I locked my phone and went back to what I was doing. There wasn't any anger left. No resentment. No need to explain myself. Ryan already knew what happened. He knew exactly when things had fallen apart. The moment he'd decided to test the relationship instead of trusting it. As for me, I finally learned something worth carrying into the future. Ryan wanted a reaction. He expected tears, arguments, maybe even a dramatic attempt to stop him from leaving. Instead, he walked out the front door and discovered I believed what he said. Looking back, that was the moment our future together quietly ended. He lost a relationship he thought would always be waiting for him. I gained the peace I didn't realize I'd been missing. In the end, that turned out to be the better deal.